And thank you all for joining me this evening, taking time out of your day to enjoy an evening with me. Hopefully, you find this topic to be really interesting. And what I really hope is that even if you are already familiar with horseshoe crabs, that by the end of my talk, you have an even greater appreciation for this remarkable species. So, to get us started, this talk will encompass horseshoe crab natural history, their ecology, the adaptations that have allowed them to persist for so long on this earth, how horseshoe crabs are connected to us and why they're important to humans, and then what their conservation looks like for the continued longevity of this species. So, horseshoe crabs evolved 500 million years ago in the Paleozoic era, and there's fossil evidence documenting horseshoe crab evolution. And if we look at the fossil record for horseshoe crabs, we can see that they've really changed very little in those 500 million years. So, a lot of the fossils of horseshoe crabs look exactly the same as the ones that we have on our beaches today. And I love this quote by two evolutionary biologists, Alexander Worth and William Shear, who said, "To gaze upon a horseshoe crab is to glimpse a prehistoric Ordovician sea of nearly 500 million years ago." And we're really looking at animals whose ancestors lived with dinosaurs, lived with some of the
Absolutely.
first animals in the ocean. And it's believed that horseshoe crabs evolved from trilobites. So we're really looking at a living fossil. And to put this into perspective for just how long horseshoe crabs have existed in this world, horseshoe crabs predate dinosaurs, they predate flowering plants, and they predate coral. And this means that they've actually survived multiple mass extinctions that wiped out between 50 to 95% of just marine species. So these animals are truly survivors, and they really found a recipe for success early on in their evolution. Today, there are 4 living species of horseshoe crabs, and they all look remarkably similar to each other. The horseshoe crab that we have off our coast is the American horseshoe crab, Limulus polyphemus, and that's the one I'm going to be focused on tonight. There are 3 additional Asian species that form their own clade, and they diverged from Limulus about 130 to 430 million years ago. Those include the mangrove horseshoe crab, the Indo-Pacific horseshoe crab, and the Chinese horseshoe crab. And you can see just by looking at these pictures that they all look relatively similar morphologically. There is overlap between some of the Asian species. So there are areas in the world where you can see 2 species, but there's very little hybridization because speciation within these animals has actually led to a lot of genetic diversity. For example, Indo-Pacific horseshoe crabs have 28 chromosomes. Chinese horseshoe crabs have 26. Mangrove horseshoe crabs have 32. And our very own American horseshoe crabs have 52 chromosomes. So they all look relatively similar, but there are differences in their genetic composition. And to put that into perspective, let's think about another group of animals like birds. Birds have been on this planet a much shorter amount of time. They all evolved from animals like this Archaeopteryx. But in that short amount of time, really the blink of an eye compared to how long horseshoe crabs have been on this planet, Birds have really diversified, and evolution has created thousands of combinations of shapes and size and color and function. Birds that are able to live in a multitude of habitats on almost every continent in the world. They're living in habitats that other animals can't live in. They've got the ability to fly. Um, and so birds have really diversified in a much shorter amount of time to live in all of these different niches, whereas horseshoe crabs have stayed relatively the same. And that doesn't mean to say that horseshoe crabs have just been coasting through life. What it really means is that horseshoe crabs have morphological stasis. This means that physically they're evolutionarily the same. So on the outside, they look the same as they did hundreds of millions of years ago. But evolutionary biologists have looked at the DNA of living horseshoe crabs, and this shows that they have as much genetic variation as any other species and as much genetic variation as we would expect from evolution. What likely has led to their morphological stasis is really that they live in an environment that has changed very little. So they live in coastal environments that are relatively stable. They most likely have always had an abundant food source, and they probably had very little competition for the niche and the ecosystem that they serve in, and very little competition to change. So our horseshoe crabs on our coast, they are a coastal species. They're an inshore species. They're spending most of the year in our estuaries, in our saltwater creeks, and just really off our coast. They will travel off the continental shelf or near the continental shelf during the winter time, but otherwise they're a shallow water species. And they can be found all the way up into Maine, but typically they're found from the Delaware Bay down into the Keys and potentially over into the Gulf of Mexico. They're eating lots of hard-shelled organisms, so polychaete worms, oysters, clams, whelks, all food that we know is very abundant on our coastline. And their main predator is really only horseshoe crabs, or excuse me, loggerhead sea turtles. Especially once they're adults, there are very few animals that can crunch through their hard exoskeleton. So their main predator are really these sea turtles. Now, what you might be most familiar with horseshoe crabs for is their mass spawning events that they have on our beaches early in the summer season. So, horseshoe crabs are generally taking over our beaches in May, sometimes through July, and they're creating these mass spawning events where they're covering the beaches. The females are hoping to find a place to lay their eggs, and the males are hoping to find a female. So what happens is during the high tides of May, June, and July, usually during a full or new moon, the males start patrolling the surf line, waiting to intercept a female that's coming on shore to find a nice high place to lay her eggs. And then the male will intercept the female and he will attach himself to her in hopes of having a good position to fertilize those eggs. Now, fertilization is external, so the female will make a shallow divot in the sand. She'll then lay her eggs, and the male will fertilize them behind her. But this creates an opportunity for what we call satellite males to come in and attach themselves to her or to get close enough to hopefully have a chance of fertilizing some of her eggs. And so this mass spawning event occurs when you've got a limited amount of space on the beach, limited number of females, and males all vying for an opportunity to fertilize her eggs. How do you tell a female from a male horseshoe crab? Well, the males have to have a special adaptation to attach themselves to the females. So they have what's called a pedipalp that is adapted into a hook. And those hooks they can then use to hold on to the female's abdomen. The females, like pictured on the right, don't have those hooks, and so her legs all look relatively the same. And then females are generally 20% larger than males. And this makes sense. They house their eggs in their head. So the more space that they have, the more eggs that they can have, the greater chance that some of those eggs will survive. So females are larger than males. And the eggs, when they're laid, are typically this light green color, and she will lay about 60 to 120,000 eggs throughout the spawning time. So she may lay eggs several times throughout the early part of the summer. The eggs will take about 2 weeks to develop. And if you were to look at them, you could see tiny little horseshoe crabs forming within the eggs. Once those 2 weeks are up, the horseshoe crabs will hatch. And then those horseshoe crabs will spend the first 2 years of their life either on the beach where they hatched, buried in the sand, or potentially going out into the estuaries where it's still safe for them. At this point, they are very vulnerable to predators, to anything that is able to eat them, birds, fish, stingrays. And so they will stay hidden and camouflaged, usually in the sand, for the first few years of their life. It's going to take males 9 years to reach maturity and females longer at 11 years. And during this time, they will molt and grow their exoskeleton. And by the time they reach maturity, they may have molted up to 17 times. After they've reached sexual maturity, they will not molt again. And that's why you'll see horseshoe crabs that are covered in these epibionts. So, algae, um, barnacles, other hard shelled organisms, snails, little crabs that have colonized the exoskeleton of the horseshoe crab. Unfortunately, of the tens of thousands of eggs that a horseshoe crab will lay, only about 10 will survive. So they have a very low survival rate, which is why horseshoe crabs lay so many eggs, and hopefully why those mass spawning events, at least some of them will survive. Now, what are the adaptations that have aided the horseshoe crab's longevity? Well, horseshoe crabs are arthropods. So they're invertebrates with segmented bodies and segmented legs. And the first segment of a horseshoe crab's body is its head, or the prosoma. Then the second segment is the abdomen, or the epithysoma. And finally, their tail, or the telson. Now, their head has some of the important adaptations for the horseshoe crab for their survival and some really interesting adaptations. So, one of the prominent features of their head are their compound eyes. And these compound eyes are unique because horseshoe crabs are actually more closely related to spiders than they are to crabs. And they're part of a group called the chelicerates, which spiders are in. Most living chelicerates today do not have compound eyes. So they don't have eyes that can necessarily form an image like compound eyes can. And so that is unique to horseshoe crabs in the chelicerate group. And they're using these compound eyes to find mates. Additionally, on their head, they have 5 other eyes that are simple eyes, and these are sensitive to visible and UV light. And remember, an eye at its most rudimentary, simple existence is really just an organ that is able to take in light. So these simple eyes are helping them to detect that visible light, potentially times of day, and then UV light from the sun. And they have eyes, another set of simple eyes on their telson, and this is going to be used for to regulate their circadian rhythm and also help them orient themselves in their environment, determine if they're flipped upside down or not, whether or not they can see light. And finally, they also have a set of simple eyes near their mouth, which they use for swimming. If we look at the underside of a horseshoe crab, there are other adaptations that connect them with spiders. So chelicera are really just appendages that are modified for feeding. And on a horseshoe crab, their first set of appendages are these chelicera, which act really as tiny hands or arms to put food inside the horseshoe crab's mouth. In a spider, the chelicera would be fangs. Then we see the rest of the horseshoe crab's legs. This is a female horseshoe crab. She doesn't have that hook, so her pedipalps are not adapted into a hook. They look just like her ambulatory legs. And then she's got a set of pusher legs, which are going to help horseshoe crabs to swim. What's really unique about the chelicera is that even though these are tiny little appendages, they actually have 3 to 4 million sensory cells for chemosensory input to the animal just on those legs. Looking at the horseshoe crab's abdomen, this is going to be where the gills are housed. So horseshoe crabs living in an aquatic environment have to have a way for extracting oxygen from the water. And so they have book gills. And the book gills are normally laid flat, but this image shows the protective flap pulled up and the gills kind of spread out. So you can see just how much surface area there is between all those little pages of the gills. So they can really extract a lot of oxygen from the water. Coincidentally, spiders have book lungs. If you see a dead horseshoe crab on the beach, oftentimes the book gills won't still be there. They get pulled out by predators. So if you find one that's freshly died, that's your opportunity to see these book gills. And then finally, their tail or telson is really just used to help themselves flip back right side up if they were to get flipped upside down. It's used to leverage them. And then, of course, they have a set of eyes on those on their tail to help with circadian rhythm. Unfortunately, a lot of people look at a horseshoe crab and think that it looks like a stingray, and there's a misconception that that tail has a sharp barb on it or is sharp itself and can hurt you. But really, the tail itself is not sharp. It does not have a poisonous barb, and there's almost nothing on a horseshoe crab that can hurt you. One of their last great adaptations that I'm going to talk about, and probably one that's really helped secure their longevity in the world, is their blood. So horseshoe crab blood is extremely sensitive to bacterial endotoxins. They have a granulocyte, so a type of immune cell that can detect endotoxins, and it will quickly seal those toxins by clotting away from the rest of the bloodstream. And so it's very sensitive, and it can seal off any type of infection causing organism or contaminant in the bloodstream. Now, humans have figured this out, and horseshoe crab blood is now extremely important to us and our own health and safety. So, horseshoe crab is blue. You may have seen images like this before. It's based in copper, not iron, which gives it the blue color. In the 1960s, two scientists, Dr. Fred Bang and Dr. Jack Levin, figured out that horseshoe crab blood clots very efficiently around bacterial endotoxins. And they created a test called the Limulus amoebocyte lysate test, or LAL is what I'll refer to it from now on. And this test was able or is able to be used on medical instruments, vaccines, intravenous solutions, anything that we may be putting into our bloodstream. It's testing for contaminants. Prior to the LAL test, medical companies were testing batches of vaccines on rabbits and waiting for the rabbits to potentially produce a fever, indicating that that vaccine had been contaminated by bacteria, which caused the rabbits to produce a fever from an infection. And so obviously that's detrimental to rabbits. It's very time sensitive, expensive. And so once the horseshoe crab test, the LAL test came about, medical companies immediately switched to that. And now labs are allowed to take up to about a third of a horseshoe crab's blood. And we know that 1 million horseshoe crabs are collected each year for biomedical testing. And of course, this happens in our very own backyard. We know that there's the lab in Charleston, Charles River Lab, that does produce the LAL test and does bleed horseshoe crabs. If you've gone to a boat ramp early in the morning, you may have seen instances like the top left of boats and trailers being filled with horseshoe crabs on their way to these laboratories to be bled. Horseshoe crabs are an easy target for this because they are slow moving, they reside in coastal shallow waters, and so they can be collected pretty readily for harvesting. You're probably wondering how many of these horseshoe crabs actually survive. The low estimate is that about 15% do not survive the bleeding process. It's part of the regulation that horseshoe crabs have to be taken back to water of the same salinity as where they were originally caught. But there's definitely reason to believe that the survivability is much lower. And historically, horseshoe crabs have not always been just collected for their blood. In the Northeast, they're harvested in lower numbers for the whelk and eel bait industry. So horseshoe crabs are collected and then thrown into whelk and eel traps, and um, they're very effective at bringing in whelk and eel to these traps, which can then be shipped across the world for that fishery. Unfortunately, we know that overharvesting does happen and is happening. In 1990, the Delaware Bay estimated that there were 1.2 million horseshoe crabs in the bay. By 2019, the estimate was down to 335,000. So the impact that we're having on horseshoe crabs could be causing horseshoe crab decline, and we know that horseshoe crabs are a finite resource. We also know that we are not the only ones that rely on horseshoe crabs. There are many species like the red knot pictured here who have co-evolved with horseshoe crabs and rely on them for their migration. And the red knot is a perfect example of this because red knots have one of the longest migrations of any animal in the world. They will travel 18,000 miles in 1 year. They overwinter in South America, sometimes as far as Patagonia, and then they nest in the Arctic during the summertime. So they've got to make that transcontinental migration twice a year. And during that time, they have to stop to refuel. These birds can fly up to 8 days nonstop, But particularly in the springtime, when they're making their way to the nesting grounds, it's imperative that they stop at these resting sites to refuel because they've got to be in great body condition when they get to the nesting sites to not only be able to produce eggs, to raise young, but also to go through their molt while they're at their nesting site. So red knots and other shorebirds have timed their migration with horseshoe crab spawning, knowing that a huge abundance of food would be available just beneath the sand, perfect for them to collect and eat on their way to the Arctic. Red knots are of particular imperil because they were listed in 2015 as a threatened species, and we know that their populations have had a precipitous decline just in the past 40 years. So if we know that there are concerns about horseshoe crab populations, what's being done for their conservation? Well, just within the past 2 years, there's actually been a lot of great advancements in horseshoe crab conservation. And so one of those is thanks to the Southern Environmental Law Center and the Coastal Conservation League. And they came to a settlement with the Charles River Labs that for the next 5 years, crabs could not be collected across 30 different beaches in South Carolina. Females can no longer be held in ponds um, prior to them being bled, which means that now females have the ability to spawn and aren't either potentially spawning in those holding ponds or are too weak to spawn after they are bled. And then harvesting does require now additional permitting for the lab. In addition to this, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also came out and declared that horseshoe crabs could not be harvested from Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge. And this was one of the first instances of a federal agency stepping in to protect horseshoe crabs. And this was specifically to help protect red knots. And this decision was preempted by a lawsuit from the Southern Environmental Law Center. Other states outside of the Southeast have also put in stricter regulations on collecting horseshoe crabs, especially for the bait industry. So, states like Massachusetts, Connecticut, and just within the Delaware Bay have set regulations on collecting horseshoe crabs, but not all of those regulations are created equal. And they're not all the same within those states. And we know that this definitely impacts populations of animals, especially animals that cross state lines, state boundaries, um, country boundaries. And so we see unequal protections for them across their range, but it is a step in the right direction. In terms of use of horseshoe crab blood for biomedical testing, there's good news related to that as well. So in 1990, the National University of Singapore created a synthetic endotoxin detecting compound using horseshoe crab DNA and recombinant DNA technology. Years later, other labs furthered this research and created another compound, another synthetic compound that did not have to use horseshoe crab blood. Since then, synthetics have become much more available, and tests have been done showing that they are just as effective as the LAL test. And we know that most of these biomedical labs, seeing that coming on the horizon, have already produced their own synthetic compound, and they've just been waiting for confirmation from regulatory agencies to be able to use it. Well, as of May 1st, the US Pharmacopoeia, which is the regulatory body for setting national safety standards, officially stated that these synthetic alternatives could be used instead of the LAL test. And this is great news. This means that companies can start switching away from bleeding horseshoe crabs and needing the LAL test, and they can be using these non animal derived tests. Unfortunately, the US is a little bit behind in this. Europe had already okayed the use of synthetics in 2020, but it's good to see that the US is now on board. We know that the synthetic compounds are just as effective, if not more effective, than the LAL test. The recombinant factor C is more sensitive than LAL. It also has superior specificity for endotoxins, and it's more consistent than a naturally derived test because there's no biological variability like you would be getting from horseshoe crab blood. And this really helps with the pipeline for this test. So, because there are synthetic versions, we now don't have to worry about a supply bottleneck that might have been created with horseshoe crab blood. In terms of horseshoe crabs and their nesting and spawning, some good news has come out of that as well. Prior to 2021, everyone assumed that horseshoe crabs were really only spawning on beaches and nowhere else. But the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources did research and found that horseshoe crabs were successful at spawning and hatching baby horseshoe crabs in the salt marsh. And in 2024, they expanded this research, partnering with other Atlantic states, and they showed that more eggs were found in salt marsh habitats, and that possibly indicates that horseshoe crabs were selecting salt marsh habitats on purpose in order to spawn. And this is really great news because anecdotal evidence has shown that horseshoe crab spawning numbers really have been disappointing the past few years. We haven't seen the huge masses of horseshoe crabs like I showed in that video. And that if you go out on beaches where we used to see hundreds of horseshoe crabs a night, you're only seeing a handful. So this gives us hope that horseshoe crabs have actually found another habitat or have always been using another habitat to spawn, and that there's another stronghold for the population. Of course, their spawning habitats, the coast, our beaches, and the salt marsh, those are our two biggest habitats that are imperiled right now, either due to climate change, sea level rise, or development. Those two habitats really need to have strict conservation easements put on them to protect those habitats for animals and plants and other species. What can you do to help a horseshoe crab or to help horseshoe crabs in general? You probably already know this, but if you see a horseshoe crab that's flipped over on the beach and it's still alive, the best thing you can do for that crab is to flip it back over. It's not going to harm you. You want to just gently flip it over by holding onto its head. You never want to hold a horseshoe crab by its tail because its tail could break off. And we know that that's an important fixture for it to survive and to flip itself back over again. If you are feeling particularly helpful, carrying that horseshoe crab down to the wet sand or to the surf line is extremely beneficial because it allows the horseshoe crab to re-wet their gills and to get oxygen and make their way back into the ocean instead of waiting for the tide to come back up for them. Another great way to support horseshoe crabs is using your money to support specific companies that are switching to synthetic endotoxin testing. So, a group at pharmascore.org has a sustainability scorecard for endotoxin testing. And they sent out a survey to the big pharmaceutical companies. And based on the answers of those surveys, they are rating those companies for their ability and willingness to switch over to the synthetic tests. On the website, the more points a company has, the higher the rating. And the website does show the survey results specific to each company. It shows which companies have responded to the survey and which have not yet. But you can kind of put your money towards conservation by how you spend it. Additionally, advocating for stricter legislation around horseshoe crab harvesting in your own state or in South Carolina is extremely important. We know that just within the past few years, this has been very successful in getting regulations to change, either with harvesting for bait or harvesting for collecting of blood. And there have been some significant changes because people have spoken out and made it an issue known to those that can change the laws. So, advocacy is extremely important to protect these species and the species that rely on them. And so tonight I want to leave you with this comic and this quote from Sylvia Earle. And I'll go ahead and read it. If for no other reasons, it makes sense to protect these amazing animals out of respect for what they represent as planetary elders. Having endured so much for so long, it would be a terrible legacy for humankind if the horseshoe crab's astonishing capacity for survival would come to an end on our watch. And I think that this quote really encompasses what it means to protect all life on Earth, that all life has a purpose and has a need for conservation. And it would certainly be a shame for a species that has outlived many, many others to die on our watch. So, with that, I hope that you have a greater appreciation for horseshoe crabs, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Sloan. I really, really, that was wonderful and a lot of new information for me as well. So that was great. Can I just also ask, in this, is that horseshoe crab tattooed? Is that the in the bottom left corner?
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
2017. Yeah, horseshoe crabs get tattoos. Yeah.
Gotcha. Excellent. Love it. Okay. A few people have comments in or questions. If you want to unmute and ask, or I can ask off the thing, whatever people want to do. Just go ahead and jump in.
I
Yeah.
have a question.
Go ahead.
When the female is full of eggs, is it the kind of thing where if you flip, I mean, you don't want to, but if you flip her over, are you able to see the thousands and thousands of eggs
That's a
visible?
Yeah, that's a great question. So no, they are inside her shell, so they're in between the two layers of her shell, but kind of just floating in her head, and in the cavity created by the dorsal part of her shell and the ventral part of her shell.
So the shell looks so thin,
Mhm.
like it wouldn't hold much.
It, um, it's pretty thick and pretty sturdy. Um, and I don't have one on me to show you, but um, essentially it's kind of like a turtle shell in that there's a top and a bottom and they're sealed together. Um, and then there's space on the inside for their organs, for their bloodstream, and for the female, the eggs are actually just kind of floating in the empty space in her head, where the two shells come together but create a space, kind of like a pocket. Um,
Thank you.
if when you find horseshoe crab molts on the beach, and a lot of times you'll find them during the summertime because the young have just hatched and they're growing, and so they're molting more frequently. But if you're able to find one that's still intact, the exoskeleton is fairly thin, and it hardens up as they grow, and as that particular exoskeleton fully forms, kind of like blue crabs go through a soft shell stage where their exoskeleton hasn't rehardened after they molted. But on a horseshoe crab molt, they essentially, what they do is they walk out the front. So in their head, a space opens up between the top and bottom of their shell, and they just sort of walk out the front. And then you're left with a fully intact, what looks like a fully intact horseshoe crab, but it's just their exoskeleton, it's just their outer skin.
And then they have to harden up.
Yeah, and then they are vulnerable for a little bit, but I don't know exactly how long it takes for that exoskeleton to fully reharden, but they're not vulnerable for very long, and they'll probably bury in the sand during that time.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else with a question?
Oh, I have a
Oh.
question.
Go ahead.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, when you look at the size of the crab and you look at the photos of the amount of blood that they've extracted from the individual, it just is mind-blowing that there's even anything even left for them in their body. It just looked so disproportionate.
It does, but one thing to note about these pictures is that vessel with blood is multiple crabs worth. So they're just using the same bottle to collect blood from multiple crabs. That's not all from one crab. But it's remarkable how much it can be taken. I mean, a third of their blood is significant.
Thank you. And I have one other question. I was wondering if we would be allowed to post the quote from Sylvia Earle on social networking, or if that was something that we'd have to get a permission to do.
I would imagine, I mean, I don't exactly know, but I would imagine if you give, as long as you give her credit,
Mhm.
you know, that should be fine. I'll tell you the source for that. There is a horseshoe crab essentially working group, and a few years ago they hosted a conference, and the outcome of that conference you can find online in PDF form, and it's essentially like the state of horseshoe crabs around the world. And Dr. Sylvia Earle wrote the
Blood, it's like
forward
like
That's what it is.
for that
manufactured
so she
blood.
wrote the
It's a
foreword
test.
for the state of horseshoe crabs.
They
And that's where
take
the
blood and they cloned it somehow, and they use it as a test.
Oh, sorry about that. I'm not sure.
That's
If you're
okay.
if you're not muted and you're not asking a question, if you could mute yourself for the time being, thank you.
I think there was um a question in the chat about how long do horseshoe crabs live?
Yes.
And I believe they live several decades. I think they can live into their 30s or longer, which really makes sense because they don't reach sexual maturity until they're almost a decade old. So they are a fairly long-lived species if they are able to live that long.
Thank you. Another question in there too is that I think in the very beginning, there were two pictures of horseshoe crabs next to each other in the beginning of your presentation, and one sort of looked like it was kind of melty. And so
Okay.
asked what that was.
Let's go back and look at the beginning. Maybe it was one of the pictures of a fossilized horseshoe crab.
It could have been, yeah, it was, I think it was at the very beginning. this one, I think. If Debbie, you can let me know.
Yes, that's it.
Yep, okay.
Yeah, so both the image on the left is of a horseshoe crab that would be alive today, and the image on the right is a fossilized horseshoe crab.
Thank you. Now that you're saying it, it's great. Anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I had a question. Is there an event that triggers the spawning? Like, or they just know, oh, it's time to lay eggs, or is it like a full moon or low tide, or is there something that actually triggers this?
So it is biological, but typically you will see the highest number of horseshoe crabs spawning on those nights with the highest tide. So that's going to be on nights with a full moon or close to a full moon, and nights with a new moon or no moon. So you'll see more horseshoe crabs typically on the highest tides, which of course coincide with those full and new moons. But horseshoe crabs will still come up spawning in smaller numbers. All throughout the months of May and June and sometimes into July. So the time of year is really what triggers it, but they're hoping to get pretty far onto the beach. And so they like to use those really high tides, particularly at night.
Kind of to follow that, are there eggs in the water all the time, or are they like up on the wet sand or the dry sand, or where are they?
They're laid in that intertidal zone on the beach. So they're laid in between the highest high tide mark and the lowest high tide mark. So typically still around wet or moist sand. And the female will bury the eggs. They're pretty shallow though. So if you went digging on the beach, you'd most likely find them. And of course, that's how migratory birds are able to find them, probing just a few inches into the sand. Occasionally the eggs will get washed away or the sand will get exposed and you'll find little horseshoe crab eggs on the beach. Otherwise, hopefully they're staying covered and giving the eggs an opportunity to grow and then hatch.
When do they hatch?
Anybody there? Anyways, I
Well-
was just wondering if the manufactured blood could possibly decrease the conservation of the species.
Oh, like, and correct me if I'm wrong, are you asking now that there's a synthetic version available, will there
Yes.
be less attention on conserving the species since we won't need them for biomedical reasons?
Yes.
I don't think so. And that's because we know that horseshoe crabs are incredibly important to the food chain. Their eggs alone are incredibly important just to migratory birds. And birders have a very strong voice, thankfully, in the conservation community. But
Yeah.
I think that we fully understand or have a really good understanding of just how entrenched in the ecosystem horseshoe crabs are, that I don't think if we stop using them for biomedical research, we will stop conserving them. I could be wrong. I hope that I'm not wrong, but hopefully we can see numbers rebound if as companies start switching to their synthetic version. And I would hope that our understanding of horseshoe crabs' importance doesn't diminish just because they're no longer important to us necessarily.
Is there any reason to believe that climate change may be an answer for the decline?
Climate change definitely plays some role, and that's just with changes in our beach system. So we know that our beaches are seeing significant changes with erosion, with just sea level rise. So that certainly plays a huge role in their ability to lay eggs and the space that they have to lay eggs. But probably a bigger factor is loss of habitat due to development. And we know that as humans, we love to develop in the salt marsh and on the beach and on the coastline. So protecting those two habitats will go a long way in protecting spawning habitat for horseshoe crabs. But I'm sure that they are going to have to adapt as sea levels continue to rise, but it wouldn't be their first time.
And do you know how long it takes the eggs to hatch?
2 weeks.
Hmm.
And they hatch to, I think when they hatch, they're about the size of a pencil eraser.
Did you say that there were 5 beaches in South Carolina that they are protected? I may have misunderstood.
There are 30 beaches where they're now protected. So there are 30 beaches that the Charles River Lab can no longer harvest from. And then U.S. Fish and Wildlife, which oversees Cape Romaine, has said they cannot take from the areas around Cape Romaine.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Anybody else? Last minute question before I thank Sloan?
Of course.
All right. Thank you so much, Sloan. We really, really appreciate it. I think this is some wonderful information. I was actually going to ask you the follow-up of but I feel like part of your presentation really gave us, some ideas of how else we can advocate and support, both, I think through, financially, as you were talking about, but also like when we're on the beach, just from basics to turning them back over and helping them get back to the water. And again, I think education, which is a lot of what I think we do as master naturalists, also to let people know their importance and that they have been around forever and that we want to keep them around for evermore. So I really appreciate that and sharing all that information and taking your time tonight. So
Yeah, thank
Um,
you. I think as Master Naturalist alumni, we are in a perfect position to advocate for horseshoe crabs. When we're out on the beach and you see tourists looking at a horseshoe crab, taking some time to educate them if they're open to it, helping horseshoe crabs flipping them back over. If someone sees you do it, they're more likely to do it themselves. And then, of course, because of where we live and we know that there are companies in our backyard harvesting horseshoe crabs, we really are in a unique position to be able to advocate for the species and take it to the state, at least the state level, to advocate for them.
absolutely.
Yeah. But thank you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Everybody have a good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.